Okay, hello everybody. I would like first to thank Stefano and Valentin for organizing this event in such a magnificent place. And I'm going to talk today about a problem that our brain must solve every day. I solved it this morning, for instance, which is to predict in a world that is both uncertain and changing. So this is how my life looks like. So every day I take this train to go to work, and everything can go fine, or it can be a real mess. And that's a bit unpredictable. I don't know every day how it's going to be. And if this is an example, well, maybe I exaggerated, it's not that bad, but let's assume this is my life. I might be interested in predicting what will be the delay of the train the next time I take it. And in order to do so, I may leverage on past observation of that and predict what's going to happen tomorrow. And why is that useful? Because if I estimate that there is a high likelihood that the train will be late, maybe I will leave home in advance to make sure I make it on time at the talk, for instance. So this is about predicting, and each day we receive new observations, and therefore we can refine our predictions. So actually today was a good day. The train was on time. Should I revise my prediction or not? Well, maybe not that much. I should not be too optimistic and think that now it's going to be fine. I should probably keep my estimate that overall the train is often late. But what if now I have 5 times in a row good days, the train is on time? This could potentially indicate that something has changed. So maybe the drivers are paying more, or there have been some engineering work on the line that makes that the system is better now. And in that case, well, I should probably revise my prediction and know that the train is going to be on time and stay at home as long as I can in the morning. So this is a simple example that shows that our world is uncertain. Every day we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it is useful to make prediction about this. And to solve this prediction problem, we must, at a minimum, extract some statistical regularities from past observations and use them to make predictions. And the algorithm that we should use to do that should somehow balance stability, so we should not dramatically change our predictions each time we have a discrepant observations, and at the same time it should be flexible, so we should be capable of changing our minds if, for instance, something has changed out there. So what is the algorithm that our brain is using to solve this kind of problem? That's kind of big issue. I'm going to just propose some solution, and I would like first to present you some evidence that our brain is indeed very sensitive to the statistical regularities of the input sequence it receives. And that's actually an old argument, data from the 70s, an experiment from Squires and colleagues who had subjects coming to the lab. They recorded the EEG activity from those subjects, and subjects were not seeing trains, but they were hearing 2 tones. You have 2 possible tones, the black and the white, and those sequences of tones were generated randomly. So this is a very small portion of the sequence that the subject were actually listening. And there were several conditions in the paper. One was that in one type of sequence, this was fully random. So there was an equal chance of hearing the black or the white, and you could really don't predict anything. And in some other condition, there was a bias. So one of the 2 tones could be more frequent than the other. And what they found is that a particular brain wave called the P300 that is elicited each time you hear a new sound, the amplitude of this brain wave is all the larger that the sound that you're currently listening was rare. So you see that you have a lot of activity when the probability of the sound was 0.3 and less when it was 0.5 and even less when it was 0.7. So shows this sensitivity of our brain to the statistics of the input. And what was particularly interesting in that study is that they also investigate whether this would be true at a much local time scale. So if we zoom in the sequence, for instance here, you could think that this last white tone is somehow rare if you look at those preceding 4 black ones. So is it the case that this also elicits higher activity than, for instance, as receiving 5 white tones in a row? So to answer this question, they make this very complicated graph that is very instructive actually. So for each of the 3 conditions, they make this kind of tree, and what is represented in this tree is the activity that is recorded for a white tone as a function of the 4 preceding tones. So here it shows the activity on average that is elicited by white when it is preceded by 4 blacks, and you have listed here all the 16 possibilities. And this is the same for shorter patterns, 8 possibilities, and even shorter patterns. So what you see immediately is that there is some structure in there. Indeed, the response that you recall to this last tone depends on what was preceding. And we can see in particular that it is the case that when you hear a white tone after 4 blacks, you have much higher activity than when you hear 5 white tones in a row. And that's even more subtle than this. If you look, for instance, at other kind of regularities, for instance here, you have a sort of alternating patterns that is emerging. And this last white tone violates this emerging alternating pattern. And well, it is also the case if you look at the data that when you violate a pattern of alternations, you have more activity than when you just continue a pattern of alternations. So you have evidence here in this data set that the brain is sensitive to different aspects of statistical regularities, computed both as local and more global timescales, and various aspects of those statistical properties, like the frequency of items, the tendency to alternate, and so on. So this has been replicated many times, including in our lab. The question is, if we were to propose a mathematical model of this, of the inference and prediction in that case, what should this mathematical model be in order to account for all these kinds of effects? And well, to answer this question, it is useful to equip ourselves with the optimal framework to learn and predict, namely the Bayesian framework. So how does it work with the Bayesian inference to make a prediction about the forthcoming observations given some previous observations that we have received? Well, it works as follows. So first you use the previous observations that you had to estimate some statistics, theta here, about the observations that you received. And these estimations that you make, well, depends on some assumptions that you have about the process that generates the observations that you received. But in the end, what you estimate is what is called a posterior distribution for the statistics, as a function of the preceding observations that you got. Then you can turn this posterior probability into some estimation, some prediction about the future, using Bayes' rule again. And then you can receive the actual new observations, and there may be some surprise at observing this. And it seems that the data I showed you are signaling this kind of surprise of the brain at receiving an observation that violate your expectations. And actually the discrepancy between your prediction and the new observation is very useful for the learning algorithm, because it can be used to revise and refine the predictions, so that you can work iteratively, predict, compare, revise, predict, compare, revise, and so on. So if we want to propose a model of that, we should specify what is the statistics that the brain estimates and how does it estimate that statistics. So we made a proposal that the brain must estimate at a minimum something that is like a transition probability between successive observations. So transition probability is this. What is the probability of having a black given that the previous element was a white? Yeah, that's this example. The same the other way around. What is the probability of having a white given that the previous one is a black? And the other transition types, from white to white and black to white, can be deduced from these two. And the second assumption of our model is that those statistics are estimated locally in the sequence. So the learner gives more weight to recent observations as opposed to more remote ones. So we can simulate these mathematical models. We can give it a sequence. For each new observation, the model is going to have a prediction, and therefore it's going to have a level of surprise when the new observation is revealed. And we can plot this level of theoretical surprise in just the same way that the author had plotted their each data. So this is the result of this simulation exercise. And you can appreciate that there is a nice correspondence between the two. So we can look in the detail, but if you take a bird's eye view and just look at the goodness of fit between the two, so theoretical surprise versus the actual EEG data, you see that there is a good match between the two. So it seems that the model is doing a good job at accounting for the observation. And this model made two assumptions: that you compute transition probability plus that you use a local estimate. So you can evaluate whether it is necessary to have those two assumptions by comparing two models that will make different assumptions. So this is our transition probability model, And this is the same simulation exercise, but for models that estimate the alternation frequency between items, and this is a model that estimates simply the overall frequency of items. So you see just by eye that they make different predictions, and if you look at goodness of fit, well, you see that the best measure is for the local transition probability model. The second assumption was that this inference of the statistics is local. So you can compare that to a model that would not have a local estimate, but have an estimate that gives the same weight to all the observations that have been received. So when you do that, this is the result, you see that you almost entirely abolish the effects of the local properties of the sequence. The trees are almost entirely collapsed. They are not fully collapsed because the experiment was not infinite, luckily for the subject. So the actual time scale of this is the actual time scale of the experiment. So this shows that it seems that we need those two assumptions, that we have a local estimation of transition probabilities. So why is it the case that the brain has a local estimation, as I just showed you? Well, it is actually sensible to do that if you're trying to make predictions in a world that is non-stationary. So this is a more detailed example of how the model works actually. So at any given moment you have observations, the y's, and the model trying to estimate the statistics, the theta, that best account for the observations. And the way it estimates the statistics is by counting observations, so pretty much like when you count the heads and tails while flipping a coin. And you, using probabilistic inference, you use those counts of the observations to estimate a posterior distribution for the possible values of those statistics. And this inference is local in as much it gives more weight to the recent observations. So basically the very remote ones, they are mostly ignored when doing this counting exercise. And this is how the posterior distribution looks like in a sequence that have a change point here. So you see that the true generative value of the statistic was at that level for a while, and then suddenly changed to another level. And you see that the posterior distribution that you see color-coded here, well, does a good job. So it is always near the true value, and in particular at the moment it changes, the inference of this observer, well, is capable of changing his estimate and converging to the new value. And why is it the case? Well, it is the case because you have a local inference. So when you're there, the observations that inform your current estimate of that statistics are mostly those ones, so the ones that are generated after the change point. And you mostly ignore those ones before the change point. So it is sensible to have this local integration when you live in a world that is non-stationary. And a lot of models are actually relying on this kind of inference. So if you know the delta rule, actually this is just what is happening in the delta rule. So this is something that is pervasively used in reinforcement learning, for instance. But this is not the only way you can have a prediction that is local and an inference that is local. And a different style of inference is the one that would be hierarchical. That is an inference that takes into account that there are different levels and different types of uncertainty that are hierarchically organized. So this is how the model looks like. You have the observations. The model knows that observations are generated based on some statistics, the theta, and the statistics are known with only limited precisions because the statistics, they can even change across time with some probability that they change across time, which is this higher order factor here. And this is hierarchical in the sense that this model actually explicitly represents the possibility that there are change points, where here the model is just oblivious of that. And just because it has this leaky integration, it's automatically, for free, adjust after a change point without being aware of it. But this one is aware of change points. And you see that you have an inference that looks similar. So this type of inference is also often used in the literature. And the question I want to ask is, what do we have in our brain? So what kind of inference styles does our brain use to make predictions? The flat one or the hierarchical one? And should we care? Yeah, I think we should care because some have proposed, for instance, that some psychiatric disorders can be accounted for some malfunctions in estimating those higher order properties of the system. And another reason why you may be interested is that, for instance, if you're a theoretician and you want to make a neuronal network that is capable of doing this, you will need to have different architectures to do this as opposed to doing this. This is reasonably simple, this is more difficult. So how do we know what we are doing? Well, just by looking at those posterior distributions here, you may have the feeling that maybe the precision of those distributions is something diagnostic about the type of inference that is made. So from now on, this precision I will refer to as confidence, because that's a human feeling, and it reflects the fact that, for instance, when you have a distribution that is highly concentrated onto one value, so high posterior precisions, where you can be highly confident that this value is the good one. Whereas where you have a distribution that is mostly flat, where you don't have any confidence about whatever value. So if you have the intuition that confidence in something diagnostic to evaluate whether we are using a hierarchical or flat model, we can test that more quantitatively with simulations. So this is the result of a simulation exercise in which we simulated many sequences, in which for generality we varied two parameters. So one parameter was the level of volatility, so how frequent change points are in a sequence. And we also vary the minimum size of a change point when it occurs. And for each of those conditions, we took the flat and the hierarchical model that are the best for this condition. And if you compare the average value of their predictions, this is the result of the correlation between the two types of models, the hierarchical and flat one. And well, you see that they are virtually indistinguishable. They have correlations coefficients that are about 1, meaning that they can make predictions that are almost the same. And by contrast, if you look at the correlations between their confidence level, you see that this is much lower. This is actually still pretty high, so something higher than 0.6, but still much lower than 1. So indeed, this confirms that inspecting confidence level may be very diagnostic to evaluate whether the system is entertaining a hierarchical or a flat inference. And for the aficionados, some previous studies have investigated that, but actually mostly at looking at this kind of estimate, what we call the first order estimate. What is your prediction? What is your choice guided by these predictions? Even what is your apparent learning rate in adjusting those predictions? And all these pertain to this class of first order estimates. And you can see that maybe this is not the best type of metric to make the distinctions between hierarchical and flat. And so in that paper we even make the case that some have proposed that modulations of the apparent learning rate may be diagnostic of a hierarchical computation, and this is indeed the case in a hierarchical computation, but in this paper we show somehow a counter example, so a flat model that actually is able to reproduce similar apparent modulation of the learning rate. So this means that observing those modulations is actually not sufficient to claim that you have a hierarchical inference. So the experiment that we did was actually in this sweet spot, and this is the experiment we run. So we had subjects in the lab exposed to sequences of two possible items, A's and B's. They could be auditory or visual, doesn't matter for the result. And this sequence of binary observation was generated according to some predefined transition probabilities. You see an example session there. And those transition probabilities were fixed only for a limited period of time, and they could change unpredictably during the experiment, reflecting the fact that our world is dynamic. And an important point is that when a change point occurs, as you can see, it resets the two transition probabilities at the same time. That will be important later. So the subjects were fully informed about how this generative process works, and their mission in the experiment was to evaluate on the fly what were the current values of those generative transition probabilities. And once in a while, we interrupted the experiment and probed their inference by asking them some questions. So you have here the two questions we asked. So first question was, can you predict what will be the next stimulus? And they answered that by adjusting a response on the slider. So this basically amounts to reporting your value of the estimated transition probability, the one that is relevant at the moment of the question, so depending on what was the previous stimulus shown. And once they answered this probability estimate, they were asked a second question, which was to report their level of confidence in this probability value that they had reported. So I'm going to show you first that subject did the task remarkably well, and to evaluate that, we can compare what they did to the optimal Bayesian observer that would solve the same inference task. So this is the result for the answer to the first question, so evaluate the probability of the next item. And here you see plotted the subjective probability estimate against the optimal estimate made by an ideal observer. So the subjects are not fully rational, they are not exactly on this diagonal, but overall they are performing quite well. And in a more recent study we could replicate this, as you can see. The error bars look smaller just because this is SEM and these were quartiles. But overall the two experiments show that subjects are indeed good at evaluating the probability of the next stimulus. Now answer to the question 2 about confidence. So I remind you that confidence can be formalized at what is the posterior precision of your estimate. So for a given average value you can have sometimes high confidence like in this red curve, and lower confidence in this orange curve. So are the confidence report by the subject rational? Yes, it seems to be the case. So if you plot the subject confidence rating as a function of the ideal observer confidence level, you see that there is a nice linear relationship between the two. And in a replication of that, we found the same results. Okay, so subjects are doing well in the task, and in particular they report confidence levels that are rational. So we can investigate those confidence levels and see whether they accord more with a hierarchical or a flat style of inference. And actually there are special moments in the task that allow to easily arbitrate between the two classes of inference. And I'm going to show you this. So on the left you will see the inference made by the hierarchical model, and on the right by the flat model. For this sequence, that's the same on the two cases that you see here. And even without showing you the result yet, you can notice that this streaks of repeated B's here is somehow surprising in the context of those previous observations. Previously the B's were mostly in isolation, and suddenly they get repeated. So it may denote that there has been a change point actually at that moment. So how the observers will react to that? Well, let's first focus on the hierarchical observer. So the hierarchical observer, upon seeing those surprising B's, will revise his estimate of the transition probability given B. So what is happening after a B? So previously we're thinking that after a B there was almost probability 1 of having an A, but when he sees that, somehow confused, you see that the distribution becomes flat, and changes his mind and refine an estimate that is about high probability that the B's will be repeated. But what is most interesting is what is happening to the other transition type. So the one given A, which is actually not currently observed during this streak of repeated B's. And well, what is happening is that this hierarchical observer, he knows that when there are change points, they are coupled. So if this one has changed, the other one must have changed as well. And you see the consequence of this. The observer was previously confident in a particular value, but upon having the suspicion of a change point, reset this value and knows that is now ignorant about the current value, and since you have no observations about this transition probability here, you just have distributions that is perfectly flat. So the interesting thing is that you somehow have a generalization of the drop of confidence from the observed transition type to the unobserved one. And by contrast, if you look at the flat model, well, the flat model is not as sophisticated than this. You just look at observations, make a leaky count, and estimate the statistics. So like this model, it will react to this series of B's by changing its estimates, as you can see. But for the other transition types, nothing happens, because this model is just counting observations, and now you have no observation for these transition types, so it just mostly keeps the same estimate. If anything, the precision of it is decreasing, because it's forgetting about the previous observation scenes, but the average value of it remains mostly the same. And you can look now at streaks of repeated elements that are not really surprising. If you look at this other example, these streaks of repeated A's, well, is not suspicious. You have a streak there, for instance. And if you look at the posterior inference by the models, so how you refine your estimate given A, well, you just keep the same, you even get even more confidence. And since you don't think that there has been a change point regarding the other transition type, the one not currently observed, you just keep basically the same estimation. And now it looks similar in the flat model. So to recapitulate, we have moments in the task that are highly diagnostic about whether you have a flat or hierarchical inference. So we made an experiment in which we made sure by design that there were a large number of those suspicious and unsuspicious tricks, and on purpose we inserted questions to the subject just before and just after, so as to probe the subject's level of confidence about the transition probability not observed during the streak. And here are the predictions from the theoretical model. So we measure the change in confidence from after as compared to before the streaks. And well, this summarizes what I've been showing with the examples. These are the predictions for the exact sequences presented to subjects. You have a marked decrease in confidence for the suspicious streaks and less for the unsuspicious one. And you don't have such a distinction between streak types for, it's a bit annoying, for the flat model. So what are the subjects doing? Well, this is the result for the subjects. And as you can see, subjects change their confidence level more after a suspicious streaks than after an unsuspicious streaks. So they have a behavior that is compatible with this hierarchical model and that falsifies basically this flat model. So in the paper we had a lot of control analysis showing that if you consider different models that would monitor different types of statistics, if you consider different parameterization of those models, in all cases you falsify the flat model. We also run a control experiment which is about the following. So in the hierarchical observer, you have this effect of streak type because there is a generalization between the two transitions. When you detect a change in one, you generalize it to the other. But this is the case only because you know that the two transition probabilities are coupled in terms of change points. If they are uncoupled, if they can undergo change point independently of one another, it should not be the case. And if you do a model that is like this and that knows about this, there is no difference between the two. So in a control experiment, so this is the main task that I just showed you, and this is the result of the control task in which the change points are uncoupled between the two statistics. And you see that the difference in streak types is almost entirely abolished, and in any case, you have a significant difference between the two tasks. So it is really the case that the subjects have a hierarchical inference and that they have some assumptions about the properties of the higher order level, the one of change points and how it is organized, coupled or uncoupled, for instance. Okay, so let me summarize what I've shown. I've shown that to predict in an uncertain and dynamic world, the brain seems to be equipped with some powerful machinery for computing statistics from an observed sequence of observation, that this inference machineries operate constantly in order to predict future observations, and you can find signature of that, for instance, in EEG data, but that's often reported in the literature. That this inference assigns more weight to the recent observations as opposed to the remote one, so it is local, and this is actually rational, and it may be a consequence of the assumptions that the world is non-stationary. We show evidence that the brain must infer to do this prediction exercise at a minimum a set of transition probabilities between successive events. This inference is Bayesian in the sense that you can entertain some degrees of belief even about some probabilities that you estimate, which I find actually remarkable because the probability is in itself a quantification of some uncertainty, but you can have some quantification of your own uncertainty about knowing this. This statistical inference seems to be accessible to introspection. Subjects can report their probability estimate and their confidence level. This inference of the current statistics seems to be hierarchically organized, and it is able to tease apart different interdependent sources of uncertainty. And last, I hope I showed you that confidence judgment can actually vary diagnostic about the algorithm that our brain uses. And in that case, those confidence judgments were more diagnostic than, for instance, inspecting the first order reports. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Il faut l'allumer. Allô? Je pas vous. Ok. maybe you can go.
So on your last bullet point, let's help me understand. You said a couple times that learning rates don't reveal these signatures, and I would think that learning rates are basically proportional to uncertainty, and so there should be a signature in learning rates that's sort of the equivalent to the thing that you're seeing in the confidence ratings, and I'm hoping you can help me understand why it is that you can't observe it that way. Does that make sense?
So first, if you think just of a plain delta rule with a fixed learning rate, well, it would not be the case. So the model would be, the learning rule would be able to adjust its prediction even in the face of change points, but by design of the learning rule with a fixed learning rate, the learning rate will remain just fixed. So not necessarily.
But the characteristic changes in confidence would be reflected as characteristic changes in learning rates on the next trial of the particular stimuli, right?
Exactly.
You see sort of reflections of those same pattern type of things.
Yeah, so this was my point. So if you have a hierarchical model and that you estimate what is called this apparent learning rate, so making the ratio between your update size and divided by the prediction error, this should change over time, and this is a consequence of entertaining those different levels of uncertainty and adjusting your learning to that. So this, taking into account this uncertainty, should be reflected in the end in some modulation of the apparent learning rate. But I really want to make that point actually, so I will show you. So this point was made, for instance, by by Behrens, so when he showed that when you are in a world that is more volatile, you increase, the subject increase their apparent learning rate. And this is an example study by Nassar and colleague in which they show that on a trial-by-trial basis, when you measure the apparent learning rate of subjects, you have a transient increase in the learning rate just after a change point. And they claim that this is a signature of a hierarchical processing, which is indeed the case. If you do the same for a hierarchical learner, you would see that. But our point was that, so this is an example of that. So if you take a hierarchical model, and you have change points that are shown here by those black lines, you indeed have an increase of the apparent learning rate whenever you have a change point. And if you have more change points, like those additional dashed lines, you have as many more transient increase of that. So if you compute the average apparent learning rate, it will indeed be higher in this case than in this case. But the key point was that this is not a landmark signature of a hierarchical inference, because you can have the same in a flat one. And to show that, we propose the following counter example, in which we somehow tweak the usual learning rule. So we have our estimation of the current probability that follows a plain learning rule, plus a minuscule modification, but this one will be critical. So the modification is that on top of your estimate that you have thanks to the leaky integration of the learning of the delta rule, you add somehow a sort of priors, and constantly. And just testing this little prior here, when you do the simulation, actually it has the consequence of showing the same transient increase in the learning rate. So they are reduced compared to that, because this is not as optimal as the other one, but the key point is that you still find them. So you still find those transient increase in the learning rate. So like this, if you compute the average between the highly volatile and the less volatile environment, you therefore also find this. So in other words, those signatures are necessary to claim that you have hierarchical inference, but not sufficient. Yes, Jean?
Very impressive. I just have one question. So, if I understood correctly, a lot of what you say depends on the fact that you assume that people learn this transition between. So can you give us an idea of how much these results would change if you assume something like a second order transition, or actually no transition at all, or something?
So I don't have the slides for that, but in our previous publication we make this kind of analysis. So we show evidence that the subjects are indeed inferring really the transition probabilities and not something simpler like just the frequency of items. And actually I have a slide of evidence for that, which is when you inspect their confidence level. So at any given moment, actually you have two confidence levels in parallel that are attached to the two transition probabilities that you monitor. But when there is a question, we ask you something that is specific about the previous stimulus. So we ask you about just one transition probability, not about the other. And what is interesting is that, so the plot that I showed you is inspecting the confidence level of subject as a function of the relevant confidence level of the ideal observer. But if you look at the confidence in the irrelevant transition probability, the one that you're not asking the subject about, there is basically no correlation. So this shows that what the subject are reporting in terms of confidence is indeed specific of the transition probability that is relevant at the moment of the question and not the other. And while you can have some other tests like this that shows that indeed subject monitor transition probabilities and not something else, which is indeed critical for the argument made here.
I'm wondering if you think the temporal locality bias that you assume is static, or if it could be, for example, interfered with by some intervening event in a task.
So what was the beginning of the question?
The temporal locality bias.
Yes.
That you assume, is that something that is static, or task or context?
Yeah, absolutely.
Intervening event that changes the assumptions about the relevance of recent data versus longer preceding data.
So in the model that I show, there is this overarching effect here, which is the frequency of change points. And this frequency of change points should modulate the locality of your inference. The more change points, the more local your inference should be. So there is evidence, not in our dataset, but in other datasets, that subjects are able to infer this and to adjust the locality of their inference based on that. So yes, there is evidence in favor of that. One important point in this study is that subjects had some prior training. So presumably they were able, with prior training, to evaluate this quantity so that we can consider that it is fixed for the remainder of the experiment.
So do you think the question that you were probing could have an effect on knowing that there is going to be repetitions, or now is the time that the repetitions are ending?
So you're asking the question whether the subject were aware that maybe some of the questions were inserted on purpose?
Could understand that this is kind of a cue.
Yeah, so actually we had the questions in the debriefing of the experiment, and none of the subjects reported that, well, the questions were maybe not located fully randomly, and there was some purpose in that. And when we probed that, when we asked them, okay, so actually there was some goal in asking the question, what was this goal? And they could not answer. So we are basically confident that, no, they did not take the question as cue of any property of the sequence itself.
Maybe one question? So I just have one question. So you started by having this very rich exploration of the square data set with all these different types of patterns that you could try to look for in the data. And then you went to your own experiment, and then you have a focus on this local transition probability. I wonder if you were also looking for some signs of the of other patterns. Like here, you're trying to just have one type of information from the sequence, from what people want to learn. But did you look for this kind of parallel learning of several patterns, like transition probability, but also alternation, and maybe more complex patterns, and maybe patterns also at different time scales?
And so, yeah, very good question. So one first clarification is that in this data set, actually our claim is that the superior effect of the local patterns can be just a mere consequence of having an inference about just transition probability of order 1 and not a higher order. So that's the first point. But second, yeah, it may be the case that actually subjects are not monitoring order 1 transition probability, but maybe order 2 or order 3, and computing with more complex patterns. So it may indeed be the case. To explore that is difficult because you have a combinatorial explosion basically. So this is why we are very cautious in this paper when we say that what the brain is inferring is at a minimum a set of transition probability between adjacent items. But it could be more complex. But the key point is that at a minimum it should be at that level. But yeah, we have evidence that maybe they are doing something that is more oriented to exactly patterns and not transition probabilities, especially at the very conscious level of the search of the patterns. But you don't need to resort to that to account for this kind of results.